Well, some Manitoba businesses are already saying that they are affected by Trump's tariff threat. How? We're going to find out today on This is Manitoba. I'm Marcy Markusa. Thanks so much for joining us here on the podcast. Well, President Donald Trump continues to send mixed messages about the tariffs. And at the start of the month, Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce checked in with businesses that it represents. It wanted to find out how local entrepreneurs are feeling about the threat of American tariffs. So it sent out a survey. They wanted to ask businesses how they're thinking. And so 113 businesses responded, which doesn't represent, of course, the full diversity of businesses in our city. But from those that responded, the message was clear. Not only are they stressed about Trump's tariffs, but the uncertainty alone about when the tariffs are going to happen, if at all, was enough to have a huge impact. Loren Remillard is CEO and president of the Chamber of Commerce, and today on the podcast, we're going to talk to him about it. Hi there, Loren.
Good morning, Marcy.
So tell me a little bit more about what you heard from these businesses that responded.
Well, what we heard was we've been saying for a while that there's significant uncertainty as a result of the threat of tariffs and that there's a cost to that uncertainty. What the survey uncovered was quantifying what we mean by that uncertainty and the impact that it's having. The fact is 62% of those participating in the survey indicated that the threat of tariffs, even before we even know what they are, has already had an impact on their operations. And on top of that, 48% said the threat of Canada retaliating against U.S. tariffs that threat has already had an impact on their business operations as well. So many businesses, that uncertainty is causing havoc in the minds of many business leaders.
Had an impact how already?
Well, impact in terms of making decisions as to finding suppliers outside the United States if they're importing goods into their manufacturing process, trying to find new markets if they sell exclusively into the United States, taking a look at their cash flow if they anticipate that there's going to be a financial impact, of which 72% of participants did say that is the number one impact right now is a financial impact. Taking a look to say, do we have to perhaps absorb some of the cost of those tariffs rather than passing them on to those that we're selling into the United States? So definitely those are ways that we're seeing it already starting to manifest for businesses.
In terms of how businesses are also thinking about how this could potentially affect jobs in our province, what did they share about that?
Right now, business is trying everything it can to stabilize their workforces, provide reassurance as much as anyone can in this environment that is the lowest option on the table for many businesses. Only 22% of those participating indicated that they're taking a look at workforce adjustments as an impact of the threat of tariffs. Unfortunately, we know that should this trade conflict escalate and become a prolonged dispute, businesses are going to take a look at workforce and saying, especially if they've lost market share in the United States and are not selling like they were previously, there is going to be some workforce adjustments and impacts. But right now, business is doing everything it can. Finding good talent remains the number one issue for our members outside of the tariff discussion. So once you have a great team, you want to do everything you can to retain them. And that is the priority for business right now.
When we had the business report on, looking nationally this morning, Chrisley Ramlakan joins us every morning, and she was looking provincially. And made no bones about it, that those of us that are in the middle of the country and here in the prairies, and Manitoba's included in this list, we could see the steepest impact from this. The Premier was on our show live last week. We were on the floor over at Peerless Garments, and he said, you're right to be here. Manufacturing is the area that we're concerned about. I asked him about measures that he's already thinking about putting in place to help businesses. What do you understand from businesses? Maybe, I don't know if that was part of the survey, but what have you been hearing maybe even from Winnipeg businesses about what they would like to see in terms of supports to get them through should this all happen next week?
Well, there's a number of options that we presented to our members. And right now, of course, the primary focus, the number one option people want to see continue is the advocacy. Continue to see our political leaders down in Washington meeting with their counterparts, pressing the case for not that the impact to Canada, let's be very clear. When we're on Capitol Hill, what resonates for elected leaders there is what will this mean to their voters in their communities, in particular in red states, let's be honest. But so continue the advocacy. For business leaders, we need to make sure that we're reaching out to our counterparts in the United States, and predominantly the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the world's largest business organization with over 200,000 members. And they have come out and said that they are opposed to these tariffs. So we need to lean into those relationships even more. But from a government support perspective, definitely we're taking a look at some pandemic era type of supports, but definitely no one's looking for that on a long-term basis. Provincially, we've been in discussions with the province, taking a look. Some of the ones that would be impacted the most by tariffs are the ones that are paying the most towards the payroll tax. So looking at some tax relief in those ways to help ensure companies have both the cash flow and the ability to hold on to their workforces. We've talked a long time, interprovincial trade barriers. We know that if we eliminate interprovincial trade barriers, the net impact to the economy would be almost equal in a positive way to the loss brought about by U.S. tariffs. So we need to break down these barriers within the country. And then longer term, and we've been talking about this unfortunately for decades, we need to diversify our markets. It's great that we have this continental connection to the United States of America, but we need to explore other markets in a much more meaningful and strategic way.
So let's lean into that a little bit, because I know we can't go back in time, and we're on the threshold of something extremely serious here. We need to stay united. However, if we have been talking about for decades needing to diversify our markets, and Manitoba maybe has not done a good enough job at that, or where would you say we've missed opportunities that maybe now is the moment where you're going to say, okay, listen, we've been saying it for years. Look here, let's do this. This is where we can, make sure that our economy sustains.
Well, I think what we've seen is there's always been an understanding that the best thing we can do is to diversify our markets. You never want to put, quote, all your eggs in one basket. But the reality is when you have a land connection to the United States that makes movement of people and goods as easy as possible. There is just a border, but we've got rail, air, ports, other ways that we are connecting with the largest economy. That's a gravitational pull and logistics benefit that's very hard to overcome. It makes it much more difficult to look at other markets and say it's cost effective to go there. So we do need to acknowledge that when you're beside the largest market in the world, it is really a gravitational pull. But one of the things definitely this is bringing about is a recognition that you can't take that for granted. You need to make sure that we're diversifying. I think this crisis will help push us towards where we need to be, leaning into more of the relationships that we have in Europe, in the Commonwealth. To the federal government's credit, over the last number of years, we've seen significant signing of free trade agreements in Asia Pacific, in the European Union. We need, as a business community and as a collective with government, to be able to start really leaning into that. But that's going to take time. And unfortunately, time's not on our side right now.
I understand almost half the businesses that responded to your survey have said they haven't taken action yet. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, we know that should tariffs come about, the first sectors to really be impacted are going to be the manufacturing, the transportation, logistics, warehousing type of industries and sectors. What you're seeing is 43% saying that they're unsure, haven't really taken any action yet, really reflects those industries that I would suggest are secondary and tertiary areas of impact. So, for example, should the tariffs continue for a prolonged period of time, you're going to start seeing potentially some layoffs. And then with that, you start to see diminishing consumer confidence as people start to worry about their disposable income, their economic security. They're not spending on things like restaurants. They're not going out to the theater and movies like they used to. They're not taking vacations because they're concerned about their economic security. And that's why I think when we talk about those secondary industries, retail, hospitality, and others, that's where they're waiting to see what's going to be the initial impact to those the primary industries and sectors and then seeing what that's going to do for consumer confidence. So it's not that those 43% haven't been paying attention or not thinking that it's going to impact them. They're waiting to see what it will do ultimately to consumer confidence.
Anything to add, Loren, that I haven't asked about? And obviously, this won't be the last time we talk in the next week.
No, you know what? This is the worst thing that we can do is, should we get to the other side of this and we avoid tariffs or they're eliminated after being implemented, we can't go back to status quo. And I think that's been too often what we've done in this country is, we made it, we got through the crisis. Well, when we get to the other side, let's make sure we're still focused on removing those interprovincial trade barriers, investing in things that enhance productivity, and do the things that we should have been doing regardless of whether President Trump won the White House and has been threatening tariffs.
Appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's Loren Remillard, the president and CEO of the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce. Well, next on the podcast, let's get to the business of building housing. And in this case, accessing funds in a very complicated way to do it. Last week, we talked to City Councillor Brian Mays about the vote to apply for funding from the federal government to upgrade one of our water treatment plants. Now, that's to pay for a long overdue upgrade at the North End Water Sewage Treatment Plant. To do that, we have to go to the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund. The thing is, we also need money from something called the Canada Housing Accelerator Fund. And the feds have tied those two things together. So the city has to meet these thresholds and change some zoning bylaws that create more missing middle housing. Now, some of you may be wondering in these conversations that can get a little bit complicated, what exactly is missing middle housing? And when you look just specifically now at what is happening with our housing situation in Winnipeg, how might that actually help us? Well, Mandy Hansen happens to be someone that understands a lot about it. She's principal at Insight Specialty Consulting in Lower Mainland, BC. She specializes in social housing and real estate, and she happened to be in our city. So we took an opportunity to speak with her about missing middle housing. Good morning.
Good morning.
So first off, you're in Manitoba this week, so I feel like I should ask you, what have you noticed about the housing situation in Winnipeg so far?
Well, it's been developed very much like most car-dependent communities pretty much across North America. You have a fairly dense central core, and the density drops off very sharply to a sea of single-family dwellings sprawling out pretty much in all directions thereafter. And that's very typical of post-World War II development.
And when you think about the term then missing middle, what does that actually mean? And how could that address maybe some of the gap that you're sort of describing that we have in our city?
Well, missing middle really is every form of housing that falls between a single-family dwelling and an apartment building. So pretty much everything in the middle. So duplexes, fourplexes, row houses, townhouses, carriage houses, anything that densifies neighborhoods kind of bridges that gap between the single-family dwelling and the apartment building. It's important in communities so that people have more choice as to where they want to live. There's more housing stock being introduced to existing neighborhoods, and so that it does, by virtue of increasing supply and reducing housing size, because generally those units are smaller, you increase affordability and you increase access to housing in existing neighborhoods.
In existing neighborhoods because the buildings are already there generally and maybe they just haven't been identified, or are we talking about new builds of this size?
Usually new builds. It would be existing housing that has reached its end of life, as housing often does, and they get replaced with, you have one single family dwelling, it gets replaced with a duplex or a fourplex, or you have a string of single family dwellings that get replaced with a series of townhouses.
Are there cities like ours that would also have been built around, very much built for cars, that have seen missing middle, an increase in the missing middle housing, help with that to sort of fill in those spots where we could otherwise end up being that big donut?
Absolutely. It's coming. It's not as common yet, just because it's gaining momentum generally across North America. I spend a lot of time in Kelowna, BC. They've had a really big push for more of that missing middle. They actually did a blanket rezoning of a big swath of their downtown area, and you're seeing like single family dwelling after single family dwelling being replaced with fourplexes and sixplexes. It works in Kelowna because the math works. The land cost is relatively cheap, and it's really the development process is really easy. But that's one city that's seen a lot of success in creating that missing middle housing.
This might sound silly, but why is it called missing middle?
Well, it's in the middle between single-family dwellings and apartment buildings. It's pretty much everything in that space, and it's missing because it's missing. We just have not been building that type of housing in many, many decades. Pretty much since the 80s is when that form of housing really put the brakes on that, just by virtue of land use policies that we made choices on back in the day.
The model's been around for how long?
The model's been around forever. You look at cities that grow up pre-car, it's pretty typical. You'd quite often have buildings with like commercial on the main floor and then a few apartments above. It was very, very common before the car, when you had to walk places, when you had to be close to services. So it was never not happening. We just didn't need a buzzword for it because it was just how houses got built. Gap that we've seen is the abnormality. And
the gap we're seeing is also because why? Because I guess the model's not as common in North America because we made the car king.
We made the car king. We did, and we had some, that single-family dwelling typology really became the primary. It was the gold standard, and it became a form of really exclusionary zoning to keep neighborhoods consistent in their character, I'll say, and really a form of exclusionary housing.
Exclusionary housing.
Yeah.
Why is it important economically for cities to have this model?
First, you're reusing and recycling and repurposing existing infrastructure. Infrastructure is extremely expensive to build. You were just talking about a treatment plant in the north end. Those are extremely expensive to build. And as you sprawl outward, the more of that infrastructure you need further and further out, and generally servicing fewer and fewer units. Whereas if you're infilling, if you're rebuilding existing neighborhoods with more density, you're reusing that infrastructure that already exists. That helps build out your tax base, so you have more taxpayers in any particular location. You have more users for existing services, be they schools, hospitals, bus transit services, commercial units, coffee shops. You have more customers for your retailers.
You were talking about, BC, and obviously you're here in Winnipeg and have some knowledge of our landscape here as well, our housing landscape. But then you've obviously heard the push against this. So the push is always against, that we hear often frequently from people, is people that fear density.
Yes.
They say it's going to change my neighborhood, it's going to change the character of my neighborhood, it's going to change parking on my street, it's just the congestion's going to be a lot more, the noise, everything that comes with congestion. What kind of pushback would you hear to this? Have you heard in other places? You mentioned Kelowna or in BC, when these kinds of models, get underway.
Basically, it requires senior leadership within the city to, make a choice and to speak out against the NIMBYs and, really argue that this is best for the whole community. You can't argue on one hand that housing is unaffordable, my kids can't buy into our neighborhood, and then also say we don't need any more housing, because that doesn't work that way. If there was enough housing, then then the market would function, and we'd be able to afford what we can afford, and the market would be able to supply what the market is demanding, which exclusionary zoning does not allow for that.
What's your thought on more cities implementing this kind of model? And beyond BC, are you seeing what's the growth that you're seeing elsewhere?
You're seeing a lot more in, Ontario's doing a lot of it. There's a big push there as well. Down in the States, obviously, there's big pushes for that as well. So really anywhere that had that car-dependent kind of typology in their landscape, they're kind of turning around on that. They're learning that this wasn't a sustainable model. You can only sprawl so far. And you need to bring people back to central services, and you need to really rationalize that infrastructure expenditure so that it's serving more people. You're getting more bang for your buck.
Do you see any, I don't know if you've done any, I mean, this is not going to be a scientific question, but because obviously I don't even know what kind of surveying you've done or who you've spoken to about this, but I'm curious whether or not you see any generational shifting in terms of how people would view these types of models. Because I know that, back in the day in Winnipeg, when people would think about, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to get a house, I'm going to have some land, like sort of achievable dreams. You're talking about now what people would think about. And now younger generations, people will be thinking differently. They'll be like, I'll be lucky to have a house. So I wonder when it comes to something like, this concept of middle housing and even living core and wanting to walk and not have a car, I wonder if there's differences in how the generations view these types of models.
Oh, absolutely. No question. The younger people are recognizing that walkability is important. Being close to your neighbors is important. And recognizing that basic premise of supply and demand that functions in a marketplace. So if they're hoping in any way to even be able to find a place to rent, let alone to buy, they're going to need to be more supply because the existing housing stock is full. People live in them. You can't kick people out to replace them. So you have to increase that supply as your population increases. And I'm seeing also a little bit with the older generation as they're realizing that they can't sustain their single family dwelling. It's getting too big, it's too much, but they don't want to leave their neighborhood. So it opens up options for them as well. They can stay in their neighborhood where they know their neighbors, where they have their routines, but just get a smaller place, something much more manageable, something where they can age in place in their neighborhood.
Really appreciate you coming in and talking to us about this really important part of our series of conversations. Nice to meet you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mandy Hansen is principal at Insight Specialty Consulting. Well, This is Manitoba for today, folks. I'm Marcy Markusa once again. Don't forget to follow and share.